Hey everyone, Flo from Off to Lens here. I'm a French Australian filmmaker based in French Alps, and today we're going to talk about the new Greyjoy 50mm T2.9 1.8 anamorphic lens. In this video, we'll talk about my experience shooting anamorphic for the first time, what I like about this lens, what I don't like about this lens, and whether or not I would recommend it. Before I start, don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like this one, and let's get into it. So first of all, apologies for not posting for over 3 weeks. I had a pretty busy month. I was in Paris for a few days and we had people over from Canada and Australia. I also went to the south of France for a week-long shoot. So it took me a bit longer to work on this video, but it's actually a good thing in a way that I was able to try the lens and to use the lens in many situations for a bit longer. And as you know, I always like to give my honest opinion, and I prefer to use the lens for more than just like a day or two before I actually make a review. Disclaimer, Greyjoy did send me this lens for me to keep, but this is my honest opinion and I do not get to modify the content of the video before it goes live. So I've been wanting to shoot anamorphic for a very long time, I think like a lot of people, but it was either too expensive or I didn't have the right camera or the right mount. So when Greyjoy approached me a few months ago asking me if I wanted to test out the new 1.8x anamorphic lens, of course I said yes. For me, shooting anamorphic is more about the look and the feel rather than trying to fit more in the frame or having those crazy flares. To test this lens, at first I used the same locations that I usually go to test other lenses, just so I could see the difference between this anamorphic lens and the other ones that I use a lot. I filmed at sunrise, at sunset, at night, during the day. I also tried to film people in documentary style. I tried to shoot landscapes and pretty much anything that I could in over 4 or 5 weeks. I shot mostly between T2.9 and 5.6, but I really tried to shoot as wide open as I could just to make sure I would get that anamorphic look throughout the whole content. Most of it is shot at 24p, but a few shots are also shot in slow motion at 60 fps. And as you know, I use this lens on a BMPCC 6K. So now let's get into the lens itself. This lens is a 50mm and a T2.9. It can be used on full frame sensors and it can also be used on Super 35 sensors like my 6K. I have the EF version, but you can pretty much get this lens in any mount you want. You can get it in PL, E, MFT, L and RF. So a lot of people have been asking me about the re-element and if you can use it on a 6K Pro. Yes, you can use it on a BMPCC 6K Pro. There's actually no difference between the 6K or the 6K Pro, and you can use the NDs as is. I think the only time you might not be able to use this lens is probably on DSLRs when there's a mirror, or if you're using any sort of adapter like a speed booster that might have a glass element or something like that, but I'm not sure. But for me, it works on all my cameras. It features an 82mm front thread and the focus rotation is 270 degrees. The lens is solidly built and weighs over just 1 kilo, and the size and exact weight depends on which mount you choose. In terms of price, after the launch period, this lens will retail for $15.99 for the EF mount, which is pretty amazing considering that this is a 1.8x anamorphic lens. Greyjoy also did mention that this 50mm will be joined soon by an 85mm and a 35mm lens. You can find more info about this lens or how to buy it with a link in the description. There are a few things that I want to mention before I start getting into this review. Shooting anamorphic is very different than shooting with normal spherical cinema lenses or stills lenses, so a few things that I wanted to address. First of all, I think to get the full potential of this lens, you probably need to shoot on a full frame camera with the 4x3 sensor, like Panasonic cameras. That way, when you apply the 1.8D squeeze in post, you will get a 2.4:1 aspect ratio image without vignetting or cropping. And even though my BMPCC 6K has an anamorphic mode built in, I actually prefer to shoot in 6K RAW because I thought that shooting in 3.7K, I was losing too much of the sensor. And also the built-in D-squeeze that you can monitor on the screen of the 6K is actually 2 times. So this lens is a 1.8, so you need to use a monitor anyway. Speaking of gear, I use my 6K with a 7-inch Small HD monitor. I had my mini follow focus from Tilta as well as the mini matte box, and I use my Nisi cinema filters. For the sequence with the flowers, and I wasn't moving too much, I actually decided to use my Easy Rig since the rig is quite heavy and I was shooting for nearly 2 hours. All the gear will be listed in the description below. For my test footage, I also did not crop the side to get a 2.4:1 aspect ratio. I decided to keep the wide original ratio as is to show you guys what it is to use this lens on a Super 35 16:9 sensor. All I had to do in DaVinci was import the raw files and choose in clip attribute D-squeeze at 1.8, and that was it. Another thing to mention is that shooting anamorphic kind of forces you to focus on the center of the frame, and since you usually get, especially shooting wide open, the soft kind of swirly edges, which I love, and it made the shooting experience very different and interesting. So now let's talk about the things that I like about this lens. First, the look. I think with anamorphic lenses it's almost impossible not to talk about the look that these lenses have. I really like the image that came out of the 50mm. I pretty much loved every single clip that I shot. There's such a distinct feel to anamorphic footage, and I think it's hard to stay neutral when it comes to liking or not liking the image. I tried to use the lenses as many situations as I could, and I was pleased every single time. I love the soft edges, I love the sharpness, especially at the center. I love the bokeh when shooting wide open, and I also like that the flares were not too crazy and felt somewhat natural. Secondly, it made me shoot differently. I've used a lot of lenses over the past few years on different cameras, but shooting anamorphic is so unique and refreshing for me that I approach and compose my frames a bit differently, and I really enjoy this. It reminded me a lot of shooting 35mm stills or even using my older BMPCC in a way that I felt that I was taking more time with each frame, so it slowed me down but in a good way. The next big thing is the filter thread. So this lens features an 82mm front thread, which is actually quite handy as a cinema lens and especially as an anamorphic lens, because I was able to use my Nisi cinema filters with just the Tilta mini matte box as a clamp-on matte box. And even though the rig was quite big and there's a lot of elements to it, it was actually still very compact and quick and easy to use. And finally, this lens feels very solid and is really nice to use. The aperture ring and the focus ring are really smooth with a follow focus, and it feels like a cinema lens, and for the price it offers a pretty great package considering that this is a 1.8x anamorphic lens. So now let's talk about the things that I don't like as much about this lens. The main one is that the squeeze factor varies throughout the focus range. This means that objects or people might actually look slightly different when you're shooting them from close focus or from far away. I haven't done proper calculations, and I'm sure there are plenty of videos out there reviewing this lens with actual numbers, but I found the ratio to be closer to 1.6 or 1.65 at close focus instead of the 1.8. I think it's most noticeable when you shoot the same subject and you move the distance between it and the lens. Otherwise you might not be able to notice it if you're shooting a bunch of stuff. To be completely honest with you, it didn't really bother me that much, and I would still use this lens for one of my projects. There are also workarounds and you can fix it in post in some cases, but I thought I would mention it because for some people this can actually be a deal breaker. The next thing for me is that I found this lens to be quite hard to mount on the 6K. On the 6K Pro it was fine, but on 6K you actually have to put quite a lot of force to lock the lens in. A plus to that is that it actually feels very secure, but I was actually a bit surprised how much force I had to use to make sure that the lens was on. Another thing is that the focus throw is actually a bit unequal across the whole range. Sometimes it feels a bit loose, sometimes it feels a bit stiff, but it's mostly when you're actually rotating the element with your hand. As soon as you put a follow focus and in actual shooting situation, you don't notice it at all. One thing to mention though is that on the focus scale it's only written in meters, and it's fine for me because I use meters, but I know that some people, like a lot of people, actually use feet, so it can be an issue and it would be nice to have both markings. Also on the lens that I have, the small metal element that is around the glass moves slightly. This is again not a deal breaker, but I'm talking about all the things that I've noticed over the past month, and I think honestly it might actually just be my unit. On the post-production side, I found this footage to be a lot harder to stabilize than my regular content. I'm not too sure if that's because it's anamorphic footage or if that's the lens. Like I said, this is my first time shooting anamorphic, so I don't really have anything else to compare it to. So if you've had this experience before, please let me know in the comments below. Also, if you do intend to use this lens on a 6K or the 6K Pro or on the 16:9 sensor, you will have to crop in the side to get a 2.4:1 aspect ratio, and you will lose the soft edges or swirly edges, which is kind of like a bummer if you really want that anamorphic look. And that's part of the reason why I decided when I did the test footage to leave the original wide aspect ratio. I think keeping the original wide aspect ratio will be too wide to use for the actual project, unless you actually need that look in that ratio. Another thing to mention is, whilst I don't like strong flares, I actually find it quite hard to get noticeable flares with this lens, even in harsh and direct light. And this is fine for me, I actually prefer that way, but for someone wanting to buy an anamorphic lens for those characteristics, the distinct flares, this can actually be an issue. And now I want to mention a few things that are about shooting anamorphic and less about the lens itself. Shooting with a lens like this means that you kind of need a big rig, which I'm not always a fan of because I like to be nimble and I like to move around and be quick, especially for documentary work. So you need a follow focus, of course, because the rotation is quite long. You need a monitor to actually be able to know what the image is going to look like once you apply the disc squeeze. And it also means that it's just harder to operate than shooting with a standard lens. I also prefer to use a matte box on these kind of lenses because I don't want to change the image. I want to make sure I'm using the highest quality filters I can. And like I said, I use my easy rig as many times as I could. And lastly, shooting anamorphic can be too specific. It can be such a strong look and feel that you might not be able to shoot all of your content with it. For example, I wouldn't use this on a fast-paced docu shoot or on a general travel video. I think anamorphic lenses work best when their characteristic will actually enhance and help the story or create the feel that you're after. So would I recommend this lens? Yes, I would definitely recommend this lens. However, I think it's important to remember that this is a specific lens for a specific look, so I wouldn't recommend this lens as a first lens as part of your kit, or even as an all-purpose kind of general lens. But if what you need or want is an anamorphic lens with an affordable price, then this is it. The image is beautiful, it's a 1.8x lens, so it gives you a great look, it's solid, feels great, and it's really nice to use. I have always been a fan of the anamorphic look, and being able to have this as part of my kit now is awesome. I think Greyjoy did an amazing job at making a solid and affordable anamorphic option that will probably be the choice for a lot of filmmakers out there. I can't wait for the 35 and 85mm to be out. That's it for me for today, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed this review of the Greyjoy 50mm T2.9 anamorphic lens, and let me know in the comments if you're thinking of getting this lens or if you are already shooting anamorphic. As always, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Also, feel free to check out my new ebook, Freelance Documentary Filmmaking, An Introduction, where you can find a streamlined but comprehensive overview from pre-production all the way to marketing, built on years of my own experience shooting short documentaries around the world.